St. Ignatius, Rules of Discernment, Rule 7, Understanding Desolation. In Rule 7, St. Ignatius continues what he has begun in Rules 5 and 6 and supplies us with further resources for taking action to reject spiritual desolation. I want to introduce this rule with an experience of Saint Angela of Foligno, who was a figure of holiness in the Franciscan tradition. In the following passage, she shares a time of spiritual struggle. And before I read the text, I want you to note in it the dynamic of what is taken away and what remains. This text is St. Angela's own words. During this period, I was in a state of great stress, for it seemed to me that I felt nothing of God, and I also had the impression that I was abandoned by Him. Let us pause for a moment and ask ourselves, what is St. Angela experiencing? Right, she's experiencing spiritual desolation. What has been taken away from St. Angela is all felt sense of fervor, closeness to God, and joy in the Lord, and that is spiritual consolation. So as you see, I've mentioned in many videos in the past that I can confidently say there is no shame in experiencing spiritual desolation. Here is another beloved saint who shares in our experience. We return to St. Angela's experience in her own words. It seemed to me that all that was left of God in me was that I did not want to fall away from His grace by sinning, or the good or evil or sufferings that the world has to offer, nor did I want to assent to any evil. So looking at this statement, this is what remains interiorly in St. Angela. It is something deeper in her than spiritual desolation, a rock-solid adherence to God, a grace at work that strengthens her sufficiently to get through desolation safely, without harm. And I might add that she also said in her writing that this intense and terrible state of torment she suffered for more than 4 weeks. And friends, I will note here that this is prolonged and deep spiritual desolation that St. Angela experienced. There are 3 qualities of St. Angela's experience. The first is that spiritual consolation has been taken away. The second is that she is in a state of spiritual desolation. And the third is the presence of a grace deeper than the spiritual desolation, a grace that is not taken away, one that remains and works to strengthen St. Angela sufficiently to get through the desolation without harm. As I read the text of her experience, could you sense the deep grace in St. Angela that was untouched by her spiritual desolation? If you can, you already have grasped the core of Rule 7. So let's turn to the text of Rule 7. The 7th, let one who is in desolation consider how the Lord has left him in trial in his natural powers, so that he may resist the various agitations and temptations of the enemy. Since he can resist with the divine help, which always remains with him, though he does not clearly feel it, for the Lord has taken away from him his great fervor, abundant love, and intense grace, leaving him, however, sufficient grace for eternal salvation. Now let's break up this text. I've highlighted several points. So let one who is in desolation consider. I've highlighted this in green because it is an action word: to consider, to contemplate, to think about the certain truths that will sustain a person in the struggle with spiritual desolation. Moving on, how the Lord has left him in trial in his natural powers. So that's the first blue highlighted one. And that is highlighted because it is the first truth to consider, so that he may resist the various agitations and temptations of the enemy, since he can resist. And that's the second truth that we are to consider, that with the divine help, which always remains with him, that's the third, that help always remains with him, though he does not clearly feel it, for the Lord has taken away, and these are highlighted in yellow because it's the action of the Lord. The Lord has taken away from him his great fervor, abundant love, and intense grace, and leaving him, however, sufficient grace for eternal salvation. So taken away and leaving him are both actions of God. We are, however, left with a grace that we need to stay solidly on track toward eternal salvation in time of spiritual desolation, to come safely through the desolation without harm. Now, before we go forward, let's do a quick review. In Rule 5, St. Ignatius counsels us to never change our spiritual proposals in time of spiritual desolation. In Rule 6, he supplied 4 spiritual tools to be energetically used in time of spiritual desolation. And in Rule 7, St. Ignatius highlights 3 interrelated thoughts that we are to consider or reflect on in times of spiritual desolation. How we think empowers our battle strategy. Now let's break down each one, and I will give concrete examples to help them sink in. The first thought, the Lord has left me in trial. The first thought to consider in time of spiritual desolation is that this desolation is not useless pain, a cruel trick of meaningless fate. On the contrary, it is a trial which the Lord has left us. And St. Ignatius invites us to consider the spiritual desolation on the level of faith, as an experience that God, in his providence, permits us to undergo for reasons of a love that St. Ignatius will describe in Rule 9. So we've seen this slide before. We know that it is on one side, there is the man who is tempted to use his smartphone in an unholy way instead of doing his night prayers. And on the other side is a woman who normally does night prayers or late evening prayers, but she is tempted to just kind of zone out, watch some TV, and snack. So if the man at 10 p.m. and the woman mid-afternoon can consider this thought, that his or her experience is not just meaningless pain, but rather a trial permitted by the Lord, they will be greatly strengthened to resist the enemy's discouraging lies. Suffering that has no meaning quickly becomes unendurable. Let me repeat that because it's so important to sink into our hearts. Suffering that has no meaning quickly becomes unendurable. And the temptation to suffering, thinking that suffering has no meaning, comes directly from the enemy to discourage us. So if the man and the woman perceive their desolation as meaningless pain, then they will probably reach to the things that they are tempted to reach for. If, on the other hand, they understand the desolation as a trial permitted by the Lord and find meaning in this difficult experience, they will be greatly strengthened to resist it and will emerge not only without harm, but with spiritual growth. Let me share another example here. From his experiences in the concentration camps of Nazi Germany, psychiatrist Viktor Frankl wrote his classic book, Man's Search for Meaning. Observing with a professional eye, Frankl perceived the difference between those who survived and those who did not. Those who found meaning in their suffering, such as wives and children who they were determined to see again, or a life's work to be completed, and the like. They survived the abuse. Those who found no meaning in their pain succumbed to their abuse. When spiritual desolation appears to us as empty pain, we are likely to succumb. When we consider its meaning, that this is a trial in which God has left us for reasons of love, we are much more likely to escape harm and grow through it. The second thought to consider, so that we may resist. So the first thought teaches us that spiritual desolation is a trial. The second tells us the purpose of this trial, so that we may resist the spiritual desolation, and by resisting, grow in the ability to resist. So I have a series of questions that I'm going to propose. How do we grow in patience? Well, the answer would be by being in situations that require patience and being patient. The next question, how do we grow in the ability to pray? Well, the answer would be by praying faithfully day after day. How do we grow in charity towards our neighbor? By being in situations that require charity and being charitable towards others. So then, my final question, how do we grow in the ability to resist spiritual desolation? You're probably catching on by now. And the answer is by being in spiritual desolation and resisting it. Spiritual desolation, therefore, is not fruitless, wasted time in the spiritual life. God permits it so that by resisting it, we may grow in one of the most helpful strengths for our spiritual life, the ability to resist spiritual desolation. If it is true that for most of us, spiritual desolation is the principal obstacle in our walk with God, then this ability is one of the most valuable gifts that God can give us. It strengthens our faith and trust in Him. God really is a good, good Father who knows what we need before we do. The third thought, since He can resist, this is one of the most hope-filled lines in the whole set of rules. Let's look at the text again. The person in desolation can resist it, can emerge from it without succumbing because of the divine help which always remains with him. Although the person experiencing spiritual desolation does not necessarily feel this divine help, for the Lord has taken away from him his great fervor, abundant love, and intense grace, that is, the experience of consolation, in which we do clearly feel his help. The Lord has left this person, however, sufficient grace, that is, all the grace the person needs to resist the spiritual desolation and remain firmly on the path forward toward eternal salvation. This is the grace, for example, that kept St. Angela solidly rooted in the Lord even in a dark and prolonged desolation. This grace is deeper than desolation, a grace the desolation can never touch, a grace that is sufficient, and many of the saints talk about. It provides all the help the person needs. Because of it, the person can always resist spiritual desolation. And St. Ignatius asks us to consider what we cannot clearly feel in the time of spiritual desolation. That is God's grace always within us, that always supplies all we need for the struggle. This strength is consideration, and it is proven evident. Father Gallagher refers to the litany of spiritual desolation as such. I can't, I can't, I can't. I can't pray today. I can't finish this time in prayer. I can't take part in this Bible study this evening. I can't spend a day longer with these people. I can't go on in this vocation, etc., etc. When in desolation, everything in us cries out that we can't. Saint Ignatius urges us to consider that we can, because though we do not clearly feel it, God is giving us sufficient grace to resist the spiritual desolation. If we consider this truth in time of spiritual desolation, its power to harm us will be greatly diminished. Here's an example of two young boys riding a bicycle. The first is convinced that he can learn to ride. The second is convinced that he cannot. The outcome is already largely determined. The first will likely learn to ride, and the second is unlikely to do so. In the first case, difficulties will not dishearten the young boy, but will be accepted as part of the learning. In the second case, the same difficulties will further convince that boy that he cannot learn to ride. Let me conclude with this question. What if the man at 10 p.m. and the woman mid-afternoon, or any of us in spiritual desolation and in a state of temptation, call to mind and consider that this experience has meaning, that it is a trial permitted by God and within his loving providence, that the reason for this trial is so that we may resist desolation, and by resisting, grow in the ability to resist, and that we can resist because God's grace always supports us sufficiently to enable us to resist. What will happen to how they and we resist temptation? As we contemplate and resist, we get stronger in resisting temptation. And as we apply each successive rule, we are growing in the ability to resist and reject spiritual desolation. And that is good news. That means that captives are being set free. Thank you for taking time to view Rule 7. And if you have any questions about this presentation or any of the presentations on the rules of discernment, please reach out to me. My email address is there, listed on the slide. And if you want to join any of our weekly times for prayer, then please consult the Marian Devotional movement, also on this slide. And may the grace of God be with you as you apply these rules to your spiritual life. And we will see you next time.